Okay, welcome to Chapter 6. The last or the third of the goals that we talked about for any economic system is economic growth. So, Chapter 6 deals with that. And economic growth is measured in something called gross domestic product or GDP. Okay, so gross domestic product, what is it? Well, gross domestic product, and I'm just going to read you the definition here, is the total market value of final goods and services produced in a given time period by domestically located resources. Okay, so let me read that again. Gross domestic product, right, is the total market value of final goods and services produced in a given time period domestically located. So let's break that down a little bit. Total market value of final goods and services. The best way to understand it really is to go back to chapter 1, right? If I asked you to draw me a picture of the U.S. economy, could you? I mean, in part, you would. Part of what you draw me is that, right? What do firms do? They take inputs and they make outputs. And these outputs, right, are called final goods. The intermediate goods are the inputs, right? So, what's it take to make a snow cone? Well, ice and, an ice shaver and syrup and, cones and, a trailer. And all of those are sort of the intermediate goods that go into making the final good, which is the snow cone. And that's what's counted, all right? So basically anything sort of new and retail level is counted. And really this model, if you think of outputs, what we're talking about is the total outputs. So all of everything, goods and services that are produced, and the given time period is usually annually. So within a given year is, in fact, gross domestic product, okay? And then the other portion of it was produced domestically. So here's what's kind of weird or funny about GDP. So if I go, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but we'll see. Texas looks a little, there we go. That's not too bad. All right, so there's the United States, right? So everything, and we'll put a little Alaska up here and put a little Hawaii there. Everything produced within those boundaries counts within a given year, counts as output for gross domestic product. Now you may say, well, what about right here, right? Germany, BMW, has a factory in the U.S. It's a German-owned company. Does their output count towards U.S. GDP or German GDP? And the answer is U.S. GDP. So again, if it's domestically located, it counts for our GDP, just like maybe a Ford factory or something like that in Germany counts towards German GDP, okay? So that's what gross domestic product is. And the most common way to understand GDP is through the expenditure way. Because if you think about it, there's a couple of different ways to value output. You can look at what it costs you to build it and sort of value it that way. But the most common way that we do it is because, think about it, again, back to the model, right? What do firms make for those inputs, right? They make payments, and that's one way you could do it. Or what do they receive? They receive revenue. And that revenue, if you think about it, is nothing but expenditures. And in this model, it's expenditures by households. But if we break the economy down to 4 sectors, okay, sort of the business sector, the household or consumer sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector, we can look at the expenditures each one of those sectors makes and understand gross domestic product that way. I'm missing my eraser, so hold on. Whoops. All right. So to calculate GDP, the most common way to do it is through the expenditure method. And again, the math isn't too difficult. Gross domestic product, okay, is, like I said, simply the summation of the expenditures of 4 sectors of the economy. The first and largest is consumption spending by households. And in the second video, I'll actually show you all of this. But consumption spending is the largest component of GDP by far. all right? And again, that is the spending that's done by households or consumers. The second sector is the business sector. And I guess I should write this down. So C stands for consumption, and it's households or consumers. I is investment, and it is the spending from the business sector or firms, all right? So, you know, every time a business spends money on, say, like a new pizza oven or a new computer system or a new building or, you know, whatever, that's investment spending. The third component is the public sector or government spending. Now this, I will tell you, one of the limitations of the circular flow model is these two sectors aren't, their spending isn't really contemplated in that circular flow model. So that's where that model kind of falls short a little bit. But there you go. And what we have there is sort of a three-sector, you know, domestic look at GDP. The only other sector that's missing is the foreign sector. And what we do with the foreign sectors, if you think about how economically the U.S. interacts with other countries, it is through exports and imports. And the important part, and so that's accounted for, it's always exports first, then imports. And that's important for a reason we'll talk about here in a sec. But, you know, if you think about it, an export, right, is something that is produced domestically, and then it's consumed overseas in another country. And again, this is from a U.S. perspective. And then an import is something that's produced overseas and then consumed domestically here in the U.S. Now, I will tell you that a condition, you know, if your exports exceed your imports, right, you have a trade surplus. If your imports, the value of your imports exceeds the value of your exports, you have a trade deficit. And that's what we have here in the U.S. So this will always be a negative number. And again, you know, let's go back to 8th grade for a minute. Remember PEMDAS? That's the order in which you do things. The P, PEMDAS, parentheses first, right? So this will yield a negative number. But that's it. I mean, that's the calculation for gross domestic product. And so if I gave you a schedule, you know, that said, you know, consumption was, you know, 12,000 billion, and investment was, you know, 3,100 billion, and, you know, government was, you know, whatever, and, you know, exports were, you know, 250 and imports were 300, then you could, you know, literally just add this up, right? So, you know, exports 250 minus 300, that's going to be negative 50, and then you add these together, and you know that would be the value of the gross domestic product. So it's really not that big a deal. Okay, a couple minor things, and then what I'm going to do is switch over and show you on Fred exactly what this looks like and what the real numbers are. Okay, but what I want to tell you are two things. So the first is that GDP doesn't account for depreciation. So especially in this area right here. So investment spending, let's think about it this way. This is all of the spending done by the business sector. So let's just break it down and say, ceteris paribus, the business sector is made up of nothing but pizzerias, all right? And all they're buying are pizza ovens. Okay, so what this looks like, or what this value is all of the pizza ovens that were purchased by businesses within a given year here domestically in the U.S. But if you think about it, there's two reasons why a business would or a pizzeria would buy a pizza oven. The first reason is because the old pizza oven broke, right? And they're replacing a broken one with a new one. Well, swapping out, you know, a new pizza oven for a broken used one, is that creating any additional output? Is that signifying economic growth in the form of more pizza that's being produced? No. And the term for that is depreciation. Depreciation. And depreciation is literally just, old stuff that wears out that has to be replaced. Versus the other reason why a pizzeria would buy a new pizza oven, and that's because, the business is going gangbusters and they're so successful, they're going to open up a second location and they need that pizza oven for the second location. Okay, now in that case, does that show economic growth? Yes, it does. Why? Because the volume of output, I erased the model so I can't point to it, but the volume of output, the volume of pizza that's being produced, grows or increases because of the second location. That is important to understand, and that represents sort of economic growth. So what we do is we can talk about the difference between investment and net investment. And to calculate net investment, you'd simply take your investment, right, all of the pizza ovens that were purchased in a given year, subtract out your depreciation, and that leaves net investment, which really signifies economic growth. Okay. The last thing I want to just kind of hammer home, right? If you're walking down the street and you're running into a leprechaun, and he goes, "Hey, I'll give you my pot of gold if you can answer this question." You go, "Okay, Mr. Leprechaun, what's the question?" And he goes, "How do we measure economic growth in the U.S.?" The answer, and the only answer that the leprechaun wants to hear, is we measure in the percent change in real GDP. See how I put a star next to that? That's how we measure economic growth in the U.S. Percent change of real GDP. So we talked about real and nominal in a previous video. We can take a look at nominal GDP, right? And then we divide that by an index, a GDP deflator, to get a real value, and then we take the later and then subtract out the earlier of the GDPs, real GDPs, divided by the earlier, and times 100, and we get the percent change of real GDP. Okay, and that is how we measure economic growth.